This is IAQ Radio, Indoor Air Quality Radio, the voice of the indoor air quality industry, with your hosts, Radio Joe Hughes and the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. And now, Radio Joe Hughes.
Good day and welcome. It's episode 755, and this week we welcome back Wayne Baker after a 10-year hiatus from IAQ Radio. We're going to talk about the V in HVAC and much more. Wayne recently retired after teaching the last 11 years at the Train Graduate Training Program. And prior to retiring from Train, he worked in the IEQ and EHS professional for 25 years. And his name came up recently when he contributed to the AIHA guidance document, Aerosolized Transmissible Diseases, and we're very happy to have him back. Before we get started, let's thank our sponsors. They're the reason we can continue doing the show. IAQ Radio Association sponsors are IICRC, the Institute for Inspection, Cleaning, and Restoration Certification at iicrc.org. The Restoration Industry Association, RIA, at restorationindustry.org. The Environmental Information Association, EIA, at eia-usa.org. IAQ Radio industry sponsors are Particles Plus at particlesplus.com. Tramex Meters at tramexmeters.com. EMSL Analytical Inc. at emsl.com.
And now you can win a cool prize. It's time for the IAQ Radio Trivia question. Be the first to correctly answer. Simply email your answer to czlotnick at cs.com. Or if listening live, just text your answer from your computer. And now, here's the Z-Man.
Hello, everyone. Congratulations go out to John Lapotere, Indoor Air Quality Solutions in Sanford, Florida, who was first to identify toponymic as the type of surname derived from a specific location or regional topographic feature. Here's today's IAQ Radio Trivia question. The founder of the Train Company was an immigrant from what country? Back to you, Joe.
All right, Wayne Baker is a graduate of the Institute of Technology at the University of Minnesota in Twin Cities. He's a licensed professional engineer and a retired certified industrial hygienist with over 4 decades of experience in operation, maintenance, and evaluation of various building types. Mr. Baker has managed or personally conducted thousands of assessments of the built environment. Wayne, welcome back.
Hello, gentlemen. How you been?
We are well. I know you've had an interesting last 11 years. The last time we had you on was with Tony Havix and Tom Yacobellis. That's over 10 years ago now. It was a great show about particles, aerosols, and air filtration devices, and it still stands up, a lot of that information. So it's great to have you back. Let's catch up. What have you been doing the last 11 years, Wayne?
Well, I finally hung it up. I retired in February of last year, 2024. So been about a year and a half now, and hanging out with the dog, putzing around in the house. My wife finally looked at me and said, "You need to get out of the house once in a while." And so I actually applied for and recently started a part-time job at Home Depot of all places.
Wow. Interesting. Are you still doing any consulting, any expert witness stuff?
I am not. I've gotten a couple of inquiries, several inquiries, but in each case I looked at it and said, there's probably somebody slightly better or way better than me in terms of qualifications for those types of engagements. So I've referred them on.
But you are obviously still helping, like with writing aerosolized transmissible diseases and, still involved with some of the associations you were always involved with.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't give it up. It's just I find the topic so interesting, and I've got a stack of stuff here I've been reading, and another stack over there, and a couple of books behind me. And every once in a while, I just pick it up and sit down and do what I did for years, which was to read what my wife looks at as really boring stuff, but I find utterly fascinating.
Well, let's talk a little about your work at Train. You were teaching essentially at Train and at the what is it, the graduate training program. Tell our
Yep.
audience a little bit about what that program does and your time at Train.
Yeah, it's a funny thing, Joe. I was thinking about all of this a little further this morning, and when my wife Dawn and I moved here to La Crosse 25 years ago from the Twin Cities area, it was kind of a scary time for us. And forgive me for digressing just a little bit here, but moving from the Twin Cities, where there was probably hundreds of places I could have gotten a job, coming here to La Crosse, there was probably, oh, I don't know, three. So it was scary. And of course, I knew Train's headquarters or elements of Train were still here after all these years. And I knew about the graduate training program, but I never thought I'd be part of it. Um, but we made the move down here in faith. And then back in 2013, just totally serendipitous, I was having a conversation with some folks at the local ASHRAE chapter meeting, and I've known these guys from Train for years and years, of course, but I asked them, I said, what's going on over there? Is there any chance there might be a slot for me? Um, and a gentleman who'd gotten to know me fairly well from some of the presentations that I'd done at the local chapter and so on and so forth looked at me and said, you know what? I got just the thing for you. I got just the thing for you. You'd be great as a teacher. And I said, tell me more about that. And sure enough, a few weeks later, I was interviewing, excuse me. And a few weeks after that, I started what would become the final leg of a 42-year career by being I don't know, teacher, a technical instructor, whatever you want to call it, in this thing called the graduate training program.
Well, how long is this graduate training program?
It has always been 20 weeks long. 20
Wow.
weeks, guys. We'd bring in 40, 50, 60, mostly I'll call them freshly minted, freshly graduated, mostly mechanical engineers into the program. And we move them to La Crosse, and they move to this little town in Wisconsin, many of whom think, oh my God, how am I going to survive? And then they discover La Crosse is actually a pretty cool town, right? It's a college town,
Yeah.
and they have a great time. But we have them for 5 months, and it has always been a rigorous, grueling program. In fact, some folks have described it as HVAC boot camp. And I jokingly tell people that what we try and do is teach these young men and women, whom, by the way, we get them from all over the globe. International students are not uncommon. Southeast Asia, of course, Canada, South America, Latin America. And what I tell people jokingly is that we try to teach them what they don't teach us in engineer school, which is anything practical.
Now, what do these ladies and gentlemen go on to do after they leave the graduate training program? Are they engineers at Train? Are they out in the field? Are they salespeople? What are they?
Yeah, great question. In fact, the GTP, Graduate Training Program, was initially created by Reuben and Ribbentrain back in the middle 20s. And it was in recognition of the fact that what Train had developed and patented and was manufacturing was a unique product that was somewhat complicated. It was all about basically steam heating. It can't be that complicated. It's not rocket science, but what they wanted to do was to change their marketing and distribution thought process. And so the very first graduate training program, here's actually a photo. Let's see if I don't suppose it's going to focus for me, is it?
Not focusing.
But it's they called it at the time the Train Assistant Branch Office Manager class. And it started in 1925.
Wow.
And that first group graduated in 1926. So it's kind of cool, right? Next year will be 100-year anniversary of this thing we call GTP.
Oh, fascinating. And then they go out and do all types
Oh,
of
sorry.
jobs.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea was primarily to serve as, I guess, what we call account managers today, the more polite term. I guess um, we try and avoid the term sales engineer, but the hell, that's what they are, you guys. They're sales engineers. They're primarily out in the sales offices, but they also go into various other aspects of the company, into manufacturing, or it's a certainly a track to our applications engineers, some of the brightest and best that Train has in the way of their engineering core. So they can go on to do any number of things within the company, but primarily it's the sales engineers.
I've got a follow-up.
Go ahead, Cliff.
Yeah, I think what you're doing is fascinating, but okay, so 40 to 60 people are going to get there. And this has Train interviewed all these people before? So do you
Yeah.
whittle down the number of applicants greater than that, or is whittled down to that? And are they interviewed? Do they have some sort of commitment to be willing to go to work for Train afterwards, or do they have to pay a tuition, or all those interesting things? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's funny you should ask that, Cliff, because at one time, these young men and women would come to La Crosse and they wouldn't know where they were going to go. They could be going to a sales office in California or New York or heaven only knows. And while they were here in La Crosse, they would interview for these different. Today, it works differently. The sales offices do the hiring, right? And then they decide when it's appropriate for one of these folks to spend 5 months up here in La Crosse.
Gotcha.
And there generally is more demand than we've had capacity to accommodate that demand. In fact, Train just a few years ago invested a whole bunch of money in remodeling and revising a new classroom space for us in one of the buildings here in the La Crosse campus. And so we can accommodate a few more, probably as many as 65 or 70 at a time. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm curious, when we were getting ready for this interview, I had a note. The most valuable topic taught was the 8 weeks of HVAC fundamentals. That's interesting to me. You would think coming in, they would know the HVAC fundamentals, right? But apparently that became very valuable in your eyes.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. Unless we do get a certain number of attendees that actually chose electives or certain courses in HVAC and R, but not always. It's probably 10% come in with that academic background.
Okay.
And so the program for years has been divided into 3 segments. Okay, so fundamentals being the first 8 weeks, and then we go into systems and system designs the next 8 weeks, and then the final 4 weeks would be historically has been tying it all together and really preparing them for the sales role. And you could consider those first 8 weeks, guys, it's kind of a mini master's degree in mechanical engineering, at least in terms of HVAC systems. So things like, the basics, heat transfer, psychrometrics, acoustics, refrigerants and refrigeration cycles, and what does a compressor do, and a real deep dive into coils and coil selection and those types of things that you're not going to get in college.
Do you know if other, I would imagine other manufacturers have similar programs, or do you think this is kind of unique to Train?
Yeah. I got to be careful here. I'm retired from Train. I'm wearing a Train hat, but this is not a Train commercial, so I'm going to try and avoid that. But I will say this. I have seen the materials from other companies, and I know the gentleman up in Minneapolis. I've known him for years that taught the course for a company up in the Twin Cities. And I've seen their material, and it's really good, but it's not the same.
Gotcha. All right, listen, what happened? You happened to be at Train during COVID. Um,
Yeah.
and now AIHA has put out a new guidance document called Aerosolized Transmissible Diseases. And a mutual friend of ours pointed out sorry about that, your work on that and how valuable your work, and in particular your work on the ventilation topic was. First, how did COVID affect your time at Train, if it did?
Oh, it's horrible.
Yeah.
It was horrible. We went virtual. We went virtual for a few classes. So I had an experience much like this each and every day, with these young attendees stuck here in La Crosse, stuck in their hotel room or stuck in the house they were renting. Everything was virtual, and it was hard. You missed that, obviously, personal connection, the ability to shake hands and look one another in the eye. So it was horrible. We had to completely redo, how we administered testing and checking homework, because there's homework to be done when you're in a program of this type. Yeah, it stunk. I'll be honest with you.
And do you know? I mean, I assume it affected sales tremendously.
Well, yeah, and you guys, you all know this, the supply chain shortages that
That
came
too.
out of the pandemic,
Yep.
had a tremendous impact on lead times for the manufacturing process, and yeah, things ground to a halt in many respects for a very long time.
Let's talk about this whole idea of ventilation, okay? I'd like to start with some general thoughts from that document. We were talking about the aerosolized transmissible diseases, and then get a little more specific. They start with the hierarchy of controls, which I think most of our audience is familiar with, and then the creative common Swiss cheese model of accident causation. I found that interesting. We've talked about that on the show as well. But maybe you could tell us a little more about the whole idea of the Swiss cheese model that's seems pretty prominent in that paper.
Yeah. So I just removed the background effects from my screen. So hopefully I can share my screen at a couple of points here.
Okay.
Let me see if I can pull up, that document. Actually, whoopsie. Oh, sure. Then I went and closed it. Well done, Wayne. Dummy.
Well,
Um,
and while you're doing that, I'll mention that the hierarchy of controls didn't work in some ways as well. I mean, it worked well for COVID, but there were certain things within that hierarchy that weren't like you couldn't change out COVID for some other, like, less hazardous issue. So that kind of messed up your hierarchy a little bit.
that's exactly right. Let me see if I can successfully do this now. If I can share my screen with y'all. And then hop over to, yeah,
There you
hopefully
go.
you're seeing that.
There it is.
Hopefully, yeah, cool. And so I think what you're referring to, Joe, is, down a couple of pages, and we get into the hierarchy controls, which, folks that
That's
have so we've seen this for years, right? Most effect,
substitution was the word I was looking for. Substitution was not possible.
yeah. So the whole idea here of the hierarchy, of course, just very briefly, most effective when you're facing some type of, hazardous substance or infectious disease. Most effective, of course, is to eliminate the hazard. Substitution is next most effective. Engineering controls are less effective, and by the time you have to resort to PPE, then it helps, it works, but it's not as effective as the other approaches. So the Swiss cheese model, shown here, actually says, you know what, if we use elements of that hierarchy and we stack them together like slices of Swiss cheese, there might be a hole in this control method, but the next control method, the holes won't align, and we'll capture the bad stuff before we can inhale it, and it becomes harmful.
Yep, I never know where the creative. I heard of the Swiss cheese model, but not the Creative Commons. I'm not sure exactly what that is, but not really that important right now. All right, now under the section on mechanical dilution, and maybe you can pull this up while I'm reading it here, Wayne. In the short term, maximizing the amount of outdoor dilution air that an HVAC system can reliably deliver while still providing adequate temperature and humidity control, along with improving the filtration of recirculated air, are likely the only approaches that can be practically implemented during an outbreak. I wonder if you could add to it a little bit on a little bit on this section.
Well, this is essentially what we tried to do to the extent possible, right, during the pandemic. The guidance from all of the what we might call cognizant authorities, from Harvard and NIOSH and OSHA and EPA, and everybody agreed that, hey, we can improve the situation if we open a window, so to speak. Well, let's open the windows. In other words, with a mechanical system, you bring in more outdoor air, and where we can, let's improve filtration, because we're trying to knock those darn particles out of the air that carry the virus. Pardon me. And what we discovered was that, frankly, most mechanical systems, in my experience over the years, I remember specifying what were called FAR 3030 filters. Today we'll call them MERV 8 filters, right? And we discovered that you could actually put in a MERV 11 or even a MERV 13 filter into those same systems, and it would still work okay. You might have a little less airflow. You might have to run the fan harder, but in most cases, it would work. There were a few systems out there that just couldn't hold up to the additional pressure drop imposed by a higher efficient, a more efficient filter. But in most cases, it worked. So bring in as much outdoor air as you can, use better filters, and if you want to do even better than that, let's get some portable devices in the space, HEPA filters, or you guys are all, I'm sure, familiar with Corsi Rosenthal cubes and how wonderfully they work. So that's all that this sidebar in I don't know what color that is, in tan maybe.
Yeah.
it is trying to say here.
But I think what was a bit of a surprise for the people that you were working on this document with was just defining what ventilation is. Can you talk to us about that issue? What is ventilation?
Yeah, you know what? It's kind of crazy. You would think we'd have a universal understanding when we use a word as common as ventilate or ventilation or ventilation. You'd think we'd all be on the same page there.
Or at least the ASHRAE people would.
Or at least ASHRAE. So here, hopefully my camera's working better now. So this is where I learned what ventilation and ventilation air mean. Believe it or not, this is a copy of the original 1973 ASHRAE Standard 62. Yep, I'm one of those guys. I've got every version of Standard 62 since 1973 in a big old pile behind me. And this is where I learned it. And if you go to the definitions in the original version of Standard 62, it says very clearly, under the section on definitions, let's see, ventilation air. Ventilation air is defined this way: that portion of supply air which comes from outside or outdoors, plus any recirculated air that's been treated to maintain desired quality of air within the space. And then I took the job at Trane in 2013. And
this is dash 62.1 you were holding up?
Well, it was just called 62 then.
Oh, okay,
Right,
interesting. Yeah.
this was before 62.1 and 62.2. That didn't happen until many years later, right? So this was the first version of standard 62. And then when I took the job at Train, I was kind of surprised that to everyone there helping teach the graduate training program, they would come in and they would talk about ventilation, and they meant something very specific. Ventilation within the context of the instructors, the other engineering professionals I was working with there. To them, it meant outdoor air only.
Okay.
And I got confused. And I thought, well, wait a minute, this what's going on here? And so I would eventually I would tell the young men and women attending the classes, look, this is a place where you're going to have to be careful, because here at Train, if we say ventilation, we mean just the part that we bring in from the outdoors. And the customer you're sitting across from, the consulting engineer or the building owner and operator, might understand ventilation air to mean something different. So be careful.
And is it somewhat different in different documents at ASHRAE as well?
It is. If we go back to that AIHA document, there's a section in there. The beginning of the section is a new ventilation standard, and it's the darndest thing. Is it okay if I share again?
Yes, please.
Oh, okay.
I think
Let's see.
it says ventilation, filtration, and minimizing occupant density all variably reduce airborne virus concentrations, except for some that might be a little different section, except for someone in close proximity, which is something I want to talk about when we get to it. But go ahead, run us
Yeah,
through the
no,
definitions issue.
well, no worries. So it's under this section that says a new ventilation standard, and then I think it's all kind of brought together in this highlighted box. So
Yes.
this is some of the verbiage that I contributed to the efforts to put together this guidance document. And the simple term ventilation, there's some confusion out there. And then this is what I'm talking about, right? When I learned what does ventilation air mean, it's that portion of the supply air that's outdoor air plus any recirculated air that's been treated or cleaned up or conditioned in some way. And there's it was pointed out to me. I was reminded that there's also an online glossary that ASHRAE publishes, and it's got a little different definition, right? So let's see if I can figure out how to move you guys out of the way. There we go. So there's some contradictions between the glossary and what I learned from Standard 62 all those years ago, right? The online glossary defines it as outdoor air only, right? Ventilation in the online glossary, and you can look it up yourself. There's the hyperlink. So there's some contradiction yet within ASHRAE documents or this glossary and relevant the most relevant standard. And this is not to be critical of ASHRAE, right?
No,
Okay, I mean,
no, it's a tough
there's
topic.
there's the volunteers that make ASHRAE current are amazing, and they give freely of their time. And so this is just to say, hey, heads up, people, look out for this kind of thing, because we could be talking to one another and just miss what one another's trying to say. That's all.
Well, and this also became, I think, a little more of a spotlight issue when ASHRAE developed 241. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that, ASHRAE 241, what that is, and how that ventilation air topic became really important.
Well, yeah, I'm going to be a little careful here. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on 241. I did not contribute to its development. Of course, we've all had a chance to study it to some extent. And by the way, it's currently up for public review. 241 was actually developed at the request of oh gosh, the Pandemic Task Force or some
Yep.
darn thing.
Yep.
as part of the federal government, the administration at the time. And it was one of those things that was asked of ASHRAE that ASHRAE is not known for. In other words, we want you to develop something quick, right? Not 3 years. We need this in 3 weeks. Okay, can you do that? And so the folks who valiantly offered their time to develop that document decided the only way they could do that was to not follow the strict rules of the ANSI process. So it's not. You'll notice in the title, it's not an ANSI ASHRAE document yet. And that's what they're trying to do now.
And by the way, for our audience, we did a great show with Bill Bonfleth, who led this effort, I believe, on 241. And we'll put that in the blog for folks.
Yeah.
Cliff,
and so
go ahead.
Essentially what 241 does is it takes whatever standard is relevant to your type of facility. Maybe it's healthcare, and you fall under standard 170. Maybe you're a school or an office building, and you fall under standard 62. And it essentially it does a lot more. There's a lot of good information in 241, but the meat and potatoes of it, if you will, is substituting the ventilation rates that are called out in 62 or standard 170, and it substitutes higher values, much higher values in some case. Instead of, 15 CFM per occupant, it might be 30 or 40 CFM per occupant. Again, the idea being that if we can bring in a bunch more outdoor air, we can make a huge impact on the concentration of these particles floating around carrying the virus that we might inhale and make us very sick.
I want to get into that a little more after the break. Let's stop and thank our sponsors. We'll be back with the second half of our interview. We've got Wayne Baker after way too long having not been on the show. Our association sponsors are the Environmental Information Association. EIA's multidisciplinary membership collects, generates, and disseminates information concerning environmental and occupational health hazards in the built environment at EIA-USA.org. The IICRC, a nonprofit standards development and certifying body for the cleaning and restoration industry, IICRC.org. The Restoration Industry Association, the oldest and largest nonprofit professional trade association dedicated to providing leadership and promoting best practices through advocacy, standards, and professional qualifications for the restoration industry at restorationindustry.org. Industry sponsors are Particles Plus, feature-rich particle counters and air quality instrumentation. Count on us, particlesplus.com. Tramex Meters, innovation in moisture detection and humidity monitoring systems since 1974 at tramexmeters.com. EMSL Analytical Inc., providing high-quality, full-service laboratory services since 1981. EMSL.com. All right, we're back with Wayne Baker for the second half of our interview. Wayne, why is it, I guess a lot of this has to do with, in 241, they came out with this, what was it, equivalent air changes per hour. Can you talk to our audience a little bit about that and how that kind of why this is so important? Outdoor air versus a combination of things being considered ventilation.
Well, okay, so I'm sorry, I'm going to share my screen again.
No problem.
Okay, let me move this out of the way again.
Oh, and that's another thing. While you're talking about this, one of the questions was, where is the sweet spot for ventilation rates? Go ahead. It looks like that's where you're headed.
If the question is, what's the sweet spot for ventilation rates to try and reduce or mitigate the risk of exposure to airborne infectious aerosols, I think there's general consensus that you want to shoot for somewhere around 5 or 6 air changes per hour. Okay. And that goes back to a long history of decay rates, right? If there's bad stuff in the air and we start bringing in air from somewhere, it could be outdoors or it could be elsewhere that doesn't have the bad stuff in it, we can dilute it pretty rapidly if we bring in a sufficient quantity, say 5 or 6 air changes per hour. But this table, I think, is kind of the what we were talking about, right?
Yes.
241, table 5-1 in standard 241. Essentially, this is the heart of it, and it might appear somewhat familiar, right? The tables in standard 62 used to look very similar, right? It's expressed in cubic feet per minute of air, of ventilation air.
There we go. That's why this is so important.
Right. And so places like, I don't know, office, let's say an office. And generally speaking, if you slice through all the complexities of standard 62.1 for an office, it basically works out to be about 17 CFM per person once you mix everything together. And you can see here, standard 241 suggests it'd be almost twice that amount, right? Or for classrooms, wow, oh golly, classrooms, instead of being 12 or 15 or 17 per occupant, up to 40. And lecture halls, CFM of ventilation air or equivalent clean air minimum, here's that term you were looking for, equivalent clean airflow. So it can be air from the outdoors because it's going to be presumed to be free of, and again, let's talk about COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2 virus. We're going to assume there's none of that floating around outside. And we could also supplement that with air that has been run through a HEPA filter, in which case at least 99.97% of that is going to be free of the coronavirus, right? So we could use that. So we could use outdoor air and very well cleaned air, or even air that's maybe just run through a MERV 13 filter, where we can assume roughly 80% of particles that typically carry the virus have been stripped out of that air as well. So you add all those things together. Portable air cleaners in the space, filtration done back at the air handling unit, bringing in air from the outdoors, and you mix them together in a carefully calculated way, and you can use that as this equivalent clean airflow.
And if you would, Wayne, give me the title of this document again. I was trying to remember what that was, and I don't want to mess it up. There it is. Control of infectious aerosols. Very similar to the white paper that was just published by AIHA, but a little bit different. All right, now. So
just
go ahead.
Before I forget, Joe, I would do our viewers and listeners a disservice if I didn't mention this. The version of 241 that is currently posted for public review on the ASHRAE website is slightly different than the version of 241 that was initially issued. I don't know what all the differences are, but please do take the time to grab the version that's actually posted for public review, should you be interested and care to offer comments to help ASHRAE move 241 through the ANSI essential requirements.
So I guess the bottom line is, which is it? What is ventilation air, or what's it going to end up being, Wayne? Or are we going to continue to have this kind of bit of a discrepancy here? We try to ask the tough questions here.
That's a fine question, Joe. No, here's the thing. For me, I would just like people to be aware of the fact that as with many words and terms of art in our industry, you got to be careful, and you got to look at the person across the table from you and not assume anything. Right?
Yep.
When I say up, the guy on the other side of the table generally knows I mean up. But when I say ventilation air, I want to make sure. Now, just to be certain, Mr. Customer, I'm talking about ventilation as just being outdoor air. Are we on the same page? Oh, I thought it was something different. Okay. Just have those conversations. That's all I'm suggesting.
That's very good. Just understand there is a discrepancy and have the conversations with your clients and recognize it. That's the key.
And it's not just, and I'm not blaming this all on ASHRAE. This is something that is embedded in our industry, right? You want to have that conversation with everybody.
Let's go on to I want to look at something else a little different. In the document it says and this now we're talking about the AIHA document. Ventilation, filtration, and minimizing occupant density all variably reduce airborne virus concentrations. I think we can all agree with that, except for someone in close proximity to an infected person. It seems to me we're learning a lot of COVID spread was from talking, singing, coughing, etc. Is that accurate to say? And if so, is better ventilation going to help much with those close range exposures?
Joe, did you ever play the game Angry Birds?
No.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
I have an idea, yeah.
So it's a silly video game you can play in, and you've basically got a big slingshot, and you put a bird in there, and you fire them off at the bad guys. Who are the bad guys? Oh, shucks, I'm not going to be able to remember. The bad guys were pigs. Yeah. So you're trying to shoot birds across. Okay, ballistic ballistic birds going across, crashing into buildings and knocking off the bad guys, the pigs. I don't know why they chose pigs. I don't know why they chose birds. But that's the analogy I used when I talked to the GTP class about the confusion that came about between the medical community and the engineering community or the aerosol science community in the definition of aerosol or what size particle might be subject to long-term, long-distance distribution or transmission, right? And what we discovered initially, the medical community, and I'm not trying to bash anybody here, but by and large, we were told, wash your hands, clean surfaces like handrails and doorknobs, because that's how this stuff is being transmitted. Or if somebody is sitting 2 feet from you and turns toward you and sneezes, you're in big trouble now, pal. But what we discovered is that when someone sneezes or coughs or sings or shouts or just talks, we emit thousands and thousands of these invisible particles that may carry the virus with them. And they're so small. They're in the range of a micron or perhaps even smaller. Now, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the naked virion itself was about 0.12 microns, pretty darn small, 1/10 of a micron, okay? But it doesn't travel naked. It travels as part of what we call droplet nuclei. So we sneeze or cough or sing or talk, and a little bit of stuff, a little bit of goop comes out, but that wet droplet dries out almost immediately, and what you're left with are the dried remains and we call it a droplet nucleus. Okay, and those are tiny. They are. They may start out as many microns in size, but then they desiccate, they dry, and now they're perhaps a micron or something in that range. And a micron-sized particle can stay airborne for a long time, right? Gravity isn't going to pull it down for hours. And that's what we discovered was really happening during the pandemic. It's how we saw spread across a room, or there was a certain case with a choral group, a certain case with a restaurant, and it was shown rather conclusively, yeah, it started on that end of the room, or maybe even in a different room. Then it came in and it made a bunch more people sick.
But,
did that answer your question?
Well, yes and no. Let me get a follow up here now. But isn't it, aren't we learning that that close range exposure was probably causing more of the disease transmission than the longer range exposure, or don't we know yet?
I don't know which was causing more.
Okay.
The critical thing in my mind, or to my way of thinking, is that initially we thought the only way it could be transmitted was being close to one another within a meter or 2 meters, which is why we had that 6 foot rule, right?
Right.
If you stay more than 6 feet away from a sick person, you're not going to get sick. Baloney, baloney. Because as soon as they sneeze, cough, talk, sing, whatever, it can float across the room and still make you sick.
And ventilation in general, ventilation air, whichever term we're going to use, is going to help reduce that exposure in general. And that's why it's so important as a part of this discussion.
Yeah, a perfect example of why we broadly call it dilution ventilation, right? We want to dilute the concentration of the harmful stuff in the air. And a great way to do that is by having 5 or 6 air changes per hour with air coming in that does not have the hazard in it.
And I noticed in the document, they talk a good bit about surgical cloth and cloth masks and
Yep.
N95s and KN95s. And it's at least to me indicated that they were, at least the surgical and cloth masks were better at preventing the spread from infected people as opposed to filtering out uninfected people's breathing air. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a funny thing. You ever watch the medical shows where they're supposed to be doing some surgery and the guy's got a surgical mask on? Why do you suppose that the surgeon is wearing that surgical mask? It's not to protect him or her from bad stuff coming from the patient. It's to make sure that bad stuff doesn't go from the surgeon into this incision across someone's abdomen. So yeah, that's a form of source control, right? We're going to control the source so that if I'm sick, I'm not going to laugh, sneeze, cough. Well, I'm not going to laugh at it. Okay, anyhow, you know what I'm saying. So that's a form of source control. We're going to reduce the amount that gets emitted into the environment. And there was a lot of confusion during the pandemic. Again, this is one of the mistakes we made, right? I remember I printed off a nice full color poster that I think was from Health Canada that basically said, you wear your mask to protect me, I wear my mask to protect you. That was source control. We wouldn't wear a cloth mask or a surgical mask because it's great at filtering out these tiny particles that may have been emitted by somebody on the other side of the room. It's to keep me from spreading the virus, if I'm sick, to anyone else in the room.
Cliff, I just want to make sure I give you a chance, if you have any follow-ups, to jump in here before we go to the roundup.
Not on that, Joe, no.
All right, let's go to the roundup, Grayson. All right, the roundup's brought to us by Tramex Meters at tramexmeters.com. Wayne, real quick before we get into this additive technologies question I have here, but before that, how does relative humidity fit into the picture? In some areas, there's more ventilation will mean greatly reduced or increased relative humidity, and I think it's something that sometimes we don't take into consideration.
Yeah, if we're talking specifically about SARS-CoV-2 and similar viruses, right? It's one of the slides in a slide deck that I sent you earlier this week, but let me just describe it this way. Relative humidity can have a tremendous impact on the viability, the ability to remain capable of causing infection, okay, for viruses. And it's a very and it's extremely well documented in the literature now that there's a U-shaped curve that says at low relative humidities, the virus can spread and continue to harm people. At very high relative humidities, a similar kind of thing can happen for different reasons, right? But if you're in that sweet spot of, let's say, 30 to 60%, 40 to 60% RH, there's a definite reduction in the viability and I'll say more correctly, the ability for that virus to infect someone else in the room. So RH can play a significant role in how much of the viral load we may be exposed to is actually going to survive and remain capable of causing new infection in the next guy.
And that is closely connected to ventilation or ventilation air, because if you're in a very dry climate or a very moist climate, you're going to potentially see the benefits of ventilation decrease somewhat, because you're going to increase the potential for a virus or something else to cause an infection in people. Is that accurate to say?
Yep, that's it. You nailed it, my friend. Yep.
All right, let's go to this additive technologies thing. I find that very interesting in the document, but also in some papers that you sent me. In the battle between ventilation and what you and I are calling oxidizing technologies or additive technologies, who is winning? And let's caveat up front here, we're not talking about UV lights, we're talking about ozone and hydroxyl radicals and PCO, things of that nature.
Yeah. So one of the things that is broadly recognized is that if our main ventilating systems aren't capable of giving us the desired number of air changes per hour, if the addition of portable air cleaners, ideally simple HEPA filters or even Corsi Rosenthal cubes, can't get us to that 5 or 6 air changes per hour, then we might want to augment that with some of these other more novel technologies. And there's a bunch of them out there, right? You guys remember years and years and years ago when we thought ozone was a great thing to bring into the indoor environment, and then we realized that was actually pretty stupid. But so, and again, folks listening, I'm sure have heard of this stuff. It's bipolar ionization and hydroxyl radicals and dry hydrogen peroxide and all sorts of stuff, right? And the thing that always concerned me, just because I'm fascinated, I guess, by the subject that we call indoor air chemistry, is what happens when we, with the best of intentions, bring these novel devices into the indoor environment with the intent of disabling or killing or inactivating the viral load that's present. But we've got to remember that all of these technologies are essentially organic chemistry, right? And it can be surface chemistry. It can be happening on the table in front of me when we send hydroxyl radicals into the air, and then it interacts with stuff on the table in front of me, or it can be happening up here, just in the space. And the fact of the matter is, we just don't know what byproducts might be formed as a result of putting these reactive substances into the air, forgive me for saying, but willy-nilly, without thinking about it. And I think, can I use this example
Absolutely.
again,
Yeah,
Joe?
that's a great example, because go ahead.
Yeah. So the way I described it to the people, the attendees in the GTP class was, most of the claims of these technologies suggest that in addition to having a biocidal effect, that these additive or oxidative technologies will also reduce the concentration of solvent vapors, volatile organic compounds in the air. And in fact, the claim generally goes something along the lines of, well, it'll break down all these VOCs into nothing but water vapor and carbon dioxide. Okay, so H2O and CO2. There's only three atoms there, right? Okay, hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. But then, and I remember doing this over the years, right? I would take air samples in various spaces for VOCs and get this long list of VOCs that were present. And I was surprised almost every time the lab would say there's this refrigerant and that refrigerant. And I'm like, where are these refrigerants coming from? What are they doing in this high school classroom? Right? And so that's a fact, and I discovered it myself through the lab analysis. But one of the examples I always think of is this stuff. This is we call it canned air, right? But it's not air, right? This is for blowing off your keyboard, whatever, fixing your hairdo, whatever you might do with it, right?
Or whatever. Yep.
Yeah, and we call it canned air, but it's really not. If you look closely on the back, you'll see it's something called 1,1-difluoroethane. Well, what in heaven's name is 1,1-difluoroethane? It's actually a refrigerant. It's R152A. And the name difluoroethane, okay, the ethane part means two carbons with a single bond between them. The difluoro part means that some clever chemist or chemical engineer has knocked a couple of the hydrogens off, replaced them with fluorines. So we've got carbon and a carbon, and down on one of the carbons, we've got two fluorine atoms where hydrogen atoms used to be. Okay, so now this is not, right? No, there's fluorine in this molecule, and I don't care what you throw at it, right? These oxidative whatever, right? You throw that at here. How do I break this down into nothing but CO2 and H2O? What happens to the fluorines?
That's a good question, Wayne. And I was glad you explained it that way again, because I know this interests Cliff and a lot of our audience. What does happen to that? Cliff, I want to see if you have a follow-up.
Well, no, fluorines themselves are pretty strong oxidizers, and if I'm not mistaken, maybe the strongest. If I'm not, I know that if it's not the strongest, it's way up there. So
highly reactive. That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
all right. Now, how does this differ from UV technology, ultraviolet light technology, Wayne? Because I think you and I both agree to some degree that there's some potential benefits with UV in certain circumstances, but I will let you speak for yourself.
Well, okay, I got to be really careful here. I'm not an expert on indoor air chemistry. I'm not a chemist. Heck, I'm barely an engineer, but this stuff fascinates me, and so I study it. And what I've been seeing most recently is that even UVGI can react with stuff in the air to produce undesired, unexpected byproducts. But it's like anything, guys, right? There's got to be a hazard analysis, a cost-benefit hazard analysis done here. If we can use UVGI, and I'm a big fan of upper room UVGI, right? You put an upper room ultraviolet system into a classroom, and you can get the equivalent of something like 30 air changes per hour. It really does the job, knocking out viruses and the microbiologicals. If there is some small quantity of unintended chemical byproducts formed as a result of having that constant stream of ultraviolet light flying around, somebody has to be able to say, well, yep, okay, that's a slight additional risk, but the benefit of killing off all the bad stuff in the air is worth 10 times as much. So let's do it. And
Go
that,
ahead, if I may. I don't disagree with using them in the air. I think one of the most common things now that's being advertised is putting these systems inside of air handling systems. And what's happening is that, when they're putting it into air handling systems, it may not just be in contact with ductwork. There might be electrical devices and so on and so forth that are in there, and the UV tends to break them down. But I had a very, very unusual odor problem. And this was caused by, installing this type of system into a ventilation system and putting it into a place where it could react with other things besides metal. And what I found was there's a study done by a Canadian manufacturer of this type of equipment that talked about odors being formed due to the reaction between skin particles and that UV light was creating odor problems. And we don't think about it. I think Wayne's exactly right that we just need to think about and just mention that to the customer. Because I think when you tell the customer there's nothing bad that can happen, I believe it's untrue. Go ahead. What do you got there?
Okay, so you guys will get a kick out of this. About 2 weeks ago, my forced air furnace died.
Right.
And 2 days ago, I had a brand new forced air furnace and condensing unit installed here. And by the way, I'm very proud of the fact it's actually a Train unit. And the difference, the difference for me was that I got about $1,000 rebate as a retiree of Train, and so that helped me make the decision.
Right.
But the proposal, what I'm trying to show you here, well, let me just read it. So here's the proposal I got from my residential HVAC contractor. There's an option to add a UV air purifier light for $460 to my forced air furnace.
Right.
And you'll notice I took a pencil and crossed that darn thing out about 18 times. You're putting that crap in my furnace. Okay, so now please, I have to stop because the research is very strong. And you mentioned Bill Bonfleth earlier, Joe, and Dr. Bonfleth's done a lot of work in this regard. The use of UV lights in air handling units to irradiate the downstream side of the cooling coil, that's good stuff.
Yeah.
That's good stuff. But you've got to be you've got to be really careful what you allow that light to shine on, like Cliff said.
And am I accurate in saying that's not a single light just stuck into the duct?
No, they'll have like a bank of a bunch of them.
Much more complex and expensive process, and in some cases, it can be of value for certain building owners, I'm sure. But just sticking a UV bulb in the return side of an HVAC system is not going to do a whole heck of a lot of anything.
It kind of also depends on the type of ductwork that's there because, if I was surprised to hear this, but, when you look at the sheet metal that's used for ductwork, one side seems to be shinier and one side seems to be less shiny, just like aluminum foil. And believe it or not, what's recommended if you're using UV is not the shiny one. It's the one that's less shiny because it's more beneficial in terms of getting even light within the system.
Okay.
Yeah.
I believe that.
Yeah.
Very interesting. What causes that? Is that like a coating they put on?
Well, it's galvanized, right? It's a zinc coating. So anything galvanized, it just means there's a layer of zinc on it. But listen, the point being, these people, this is a tough time to be a consumer, right? Helen and Howard, homeowner, are out there trying to make smart decisions for their asthmatic child. And they're being sold this $460 gizmo, this black light to put in the return duct in their furnace, and it's not doing a damn thing. I'm sorry. That's one man's opinion.
And another use, and I'm curious what your opinion is on this, is putting them over the coils to try and keep the coils clean. Is that a good use?
That one, like I say, has been there are any number of studies, including several in the ASHRAE journal, that show that if you irradiate the downstream side, right, because it's the downstream side of your DX coil or your chilled water coil that's wet. Right. And that's where the bacteria and the fungi and all this stuff get together and have a party. Right. If you irradiate the downstream side, you can keep that stuff from growing. And that's a legitimate application for sure.
I think we should end on a positive note, Wayne. Before we go, is there anything you'd like to add that we missed? And thanks so much for coming back. It's been too long. I really enjoyed just chatting, getting ready for the show.
Well, honestly, I just want to congratulate you guys. I mean, IQ Radio, I think you started it in what, 1856?
That's right.
Yeah, right around the same time as the Civil War, I believe, somewhere around there.
And no, congratulations and hats off to you guys. Are you kidding me? This is amazing. And I was looking through the history of who you've had on the show, and you've had some super smart, highly qualified folks on the show in addition to mere mortals like me. So I appreciate what you guys are doing.
Thank you, Wayne. We appreciate you and hope you enjoy your retirement and don't get too tied up in too many volunteer activities. But it sounds like that's what you love, so why not, you know?
Having fun.
Great. This is
Having
Radio
fun.
Joe Hughes saying thanks to this week's guest, Wayne Baker. Of course, my co-host, the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick, Grayson, Gone Fishing Fisher at the controls. Most importantly, our growing loyal audience and our sponsors. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Next week is the Memorial Day break. We'll be back in 2 weeks with the next episode of IAQ Radio Plus.
For IAQ Radio, I'm Spike Reel saying thanks for listening.